Welcome, dear listener, to a peaceful journey through ancient tales of faith and wonder. Tonight, let these timeless stories carry you gently into rest as we explore the lives of prophets and ordinary people whose encounters with the divine changed everything. Close your eyes and let your mind drift to distant lands where miracles bloomed like flowers after rain. The sun had scorched the land of Israel for 3 long years, turning green fields into cracked earth and flowing streams into empty beds of stone. Not a drop of rain had fallen since the prophet Elijah had pronounced God's judgment upon the wicked king Ahab and his foreign queen, Jezebel, who had led the people to worship false gods. The very heavens seemed sealed with bronze, and the earth lay parched and thirsting beneath an unrelenting sky. In those days of famine and desperation, when mothers wept over empty grain jars and fathers searched the horizon for clouds that never came, Elijah found himself by the brook Cherith. For months, this hidden stream had sustained him, its waters cool and clear while the rest of the land withered. Ravens, those dark messengers of the Most High, had brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, a daily miracle that sustained the prophet's body even as his faith sustained his soul. But now, even Cherith had begun to fail. The once musical babble of water over stones had grown to a whisper, then to silence. The prophet knelt beside the empty brook bed, running his weathered fingers through the damp earth that had been his lifeline. The time of hiding was drawing to a close, and in the deep stillness of the morning, he heard the voice he had learned to recognize above all others. "Arise," came the gentle command, settling into his heart like rain on thirsty ground. "Go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." Zarephath, the name carried the scent of distant seas and foreign shores. It lay beyond the borders of Israel, in the land of Sidon, where Queen Jezebel had been born and raised. How strange were the ways of the Almighty, to send his prophet not to the cities of his chosen people, but to a pagan land, to seek sustenance from a foreign widow who knew not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yet Elijah had learned to trust in ways that defied human understanding. He had seen fire fall from heaven, had watched the rain obey his words, had felt the hand of the Lord strengthen him to outrun the king's chariot. If the voice that commanded the storms and the seasons directed him to Zarephath, then to Zarephath he would go. The journey stretched before him like a ribbon of dust and stone, winding through hills that had forgotten the touch of rain. His feet, hardened by years of walking mountain paths and desert roads, carried him steadily northward. Each step took him further from the familiar territories of Israel and closer to the unknown provision that awaited him in a foreign land. As he walked, the landscape gradually changed. The stark wilderness gave way to rolling hills dotted with olive groves, though even here the trees stood gray and leafless, their branches reaching toward the merciless sky like supplicating arms. Villages appeared in the distance, their mud brick houses clustered together as if for comfort in the face of the endless drought. The people Elijah passed along the road moved with the slow, careful gait of those who had learned to conserve their strength. Children no longer ran and played in the streets, but stayed close to their mothers, their large eyes holding the solemn wisdom that comes too early to those who have known hunger. Market stalls that once overflowed with grain and fruit now displayed their meager wares with desperate pride. a handful of dried figs here, a small measure of barley there, each precious morsel carefully counted and fiercely protected. Yet, even in the midst of such suffering, Elijah moved with a quiet confidence that drew curious glances from those he encountered. There was something in his bearing, a sense of purpose and peace that seemed to shine from within, that spoke of a man who walked with divine assurance. His clothes were simple, travel-worn, but his eyes held the light of one who had stood in the presence of the Almighty and lived to tell of it. The prophet paused at wells along the way, finding them mostly dry or reduced to muddy puddles that reflected his weathered face like broken mirrors. But his trust never wavered. The same God who had fed him by the ravens and sustained him by the brook would surely provide in this new place, in this new chapter of his journey of faith. As the sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent toward the western horizon, the walls of Zarephath came into view. The city perched on a low hill overlooking the great sea, its buildings rising in terraced levels from the harbor to the heights. Even from a distance, Elijah could see that this place too had felt the grip of the drought. The harbor, which should have been busy with fishing boats and merchant vessels, sat nearly empty, its wooden piers extending into water that had receded far from its normal levels. The gates of Zarephath stood open, as was common during daylight hours, but the usual bustle of commerce and conversation that marked a thriving city was notably absent. A few guards lounged in the shade, their attention more focused on finding relief from the heat than on watching for travelers. They barely glanced at the dusty prophet as he passed beneath the ancient stones of the gateway. Inside the city walls, Zarephath revealed itself as a place caught between hope and despair. The streets, paved with smooth stones worn by countless generations of feet, wound between houses that showed both the prosperity of better times and the marks of current hardship. Palm trees that should have provided cool shade stood brown and brittle, their fronds hanging like tattered banners of surrender. Elijah's steps slowed as he entered the heart of the city. Somewhere in these winding streets lived the widow who had been chosen, though she knew it not, to be an instrument of God's provision. But how was he to find her among all the women of Zarephath? The city was not large, but neither was it small, and widows were numerous in times of hardship. The answer came as he approached the city gate from the inside, having walked completely through Zarephath in his wonderment at this new place. There, just outside the walls, he saw her. A woman bent low to the ground, carefully gathering small twigs and dry branches, her movements deliberate and economical. Her clothing marked her as one of modest means, not the rags of utter destitution, but neither the fine fabrics of wealth. Her head was covered in the manner of widows, and though he could not see her face clearly, there was something in her posture that spoke of quiet dignity, maintained in the face of loss. This, he knew with sudden certainty, was the woman the Lord had prepared. The widow of Zarephath, gathering sticks outside the city gate, unaware that she was about to become part of a story that would be told for generations to come. As Elijah watched her patient work, his heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and amazement at the intricate ways in which the Almighty wove his purposes through the lives of ordinary people. The prophet approached slowly, his sandaled feet making soft sounds on the packed earth. The woman continued her task, focused entirely on selecting each piece of wood with care, as if the few sticks she gathered might mean the difference between warmth and cold, between hope and despair. In her methodical movements, Elijah glimpsed the careful wisdom of one who had learned to make much from little, to find value in what others might overlook. The widow's hands moved with practiced efficiency among the scattered twigs, her fingers testing each piece for dryness and strength. She had done this countless times before, this daily search for fuel that might sustain a small fire for cooking or warmth, yet today felt different somehow, though she could not have said why. Perhaps it was the quality of the light, or the way the breeze stirred the dust at her feet, or simply the deep weariness that had settled into her bones like an old friend she no longer questioned. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to her son, waiting at home in their modest dwelling. How thin he had grown in recent months, his clothes hanging loose on his small frame, his laughter becoming increasingly rare. She had watched other mothers in the marketplace, seen the same hollow look in their eyes that she knew must mirror her own, the look of women who counted every grain of barley, every drop of oil, knowing that each meal might be the last they could provide. The sound of footsteps on the path caused her to look up, her hands pausing in their work. A man approached, clearly a traveler by his appearance, with the dust of many roads on his clothes and the weathered look of one who had walked far under the merciless sun. There was something in his bearing that commanded attention, not arrogance or worldly authority, but a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from some deep well within him. "Would you bring me a little water in a cup, that I may drink?" His voice was gentle, respectful, carrying none of the harsh demands she had sometimes heard from travelers who viewed local people as mere servants to their needs. The Hebrew accent in his words told her he was from Israel, though what brought him to Zarephath in these troubled times she could not guess. Water. The simple request struck her heart with familiar pain. How many times in recent months had she measured their precious supply, calculating how long it might last, how much she could spare for cooking, for washing, for the basic needs of life. Yet this was a traveler, far from home, and the ancient laws of hospitality ran deep in her blood, deeper even than her fears about tomorrow. "Of course," she replied, setting down the bundle of sticks she had gathered. "Wait here, and I will bring you water." She turned toward the city gate, her steps quick but measured, already calculating in her mind how much she could spare without leaving her son thirsty. But before she had taken more than a few paces, the traveler's voice called out again, stopping her in her tracks. "And bring me a morsel of bread in your hand, if you please." Bread. The word hung in the air between them like a physical thing, heavy with implications that made her heart race and her hands tremble. She turned back to face him, this stranger who had unknowingly asked for the one thing she could not give. And for a moment, the carefully maintained composure that had carried her through months of hardship threatened to crumble. "As the Lord your God lives," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her, "I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. See, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The words came out in a rush, carrying with them all the weight of her desperation, her careful planning, her acceptance of what seemed inevitable. This was to be their last meal, she and her beloved son. She had counted and recounted the meager supplies, had stretched them as far as her ingenuity could manage, but mathematics was an unforgiving master. After today, there would be nothing left but to face whatever came with as much dignity as they could muster. The stranger listened to her words without shock or judgment, his eyes holding a compassion that seemed to encompass not just her individual struggle, but the suffering of all who had been touched by the long drought. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a moment, as if weighing not just her words, but her very soul, seeing depths and possibilities that remained hidden from her own understanding. "Do not fear," he said finally, and there was something in his tone that made her believe, if only for an instant, that such a thing might be possible. "Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son." The audacity of the request should have angered her, should have sent her away shaking her head at the selfishness of travelers who would ask a starving woman to feed them first. But there was something else in his words, something that made her heart quicken with a sensation she had almost forgotten: hope. "For thus says the Lord God of Israel," the stranger continued, his voice taking on a resonance that seemed to echo from hills and valleys far beyond this dusty ground outside Zarephath's gates. "The bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth. The Lord God of Israel." Now she understood who stood before her, not merely a traveler, but a prophet of the Hebrew God, the same deity her own people spoke of in whispers, the one who was said to control the very rains that had been withheld for so long. The realization should have frightened her, for she was not of his people, did not worship at his altars or know his customs. Yet instead of fear, she felt a strange stirring in her spirit, as if something long dormant was beginning to awaken. The promise he offered defied everything she knew about the physical world, everything she had learned about scarcity and limitation. Flour that would not be used up, oil that would not run dry. It sounded like the stuff of children's tales, of stories told around fires when the world was young, and magic still danced in the shadows between reality and dream. Yet looking into the prophet's eyes, she found herself believing not in magic, but in something far more powerful, the possibility that the God of Israel might indeed have purposes that transcended the ordinary laws of nature. Standing there in the dust outside Zarephath's gates, with her meager bundle of sticks at her feet, and the afternoon sun beating down upon them both, the widow faced a choice that would define not only her future, but that of her son. She could retreat into the safety of despair, hold tight to the little she had left, and face the inevitable with the cold comfort of predictability. Or she could step forward into the unknown, trust in the word of this foreign prophet, and discover what lay beyond the boundaries of her understanding. The decision, when it came, surprised her with its swiftness and certainty. Perhaps it was the quiet authority in the prophet's voice, or the desperate hope that had been kindled in her heart, or simply the recognition that she had already resigned herself to death. What was there left to lose? Whatever the reason, she found herself nodding, her hands already reaching for the sticks she had gathered. "I will do as you have said," she replied, her voice stronger than she had expected. "Wait here, and I will bring you the cake and water as well." As she walked back toward the city gate, her bundle of sticks secure under her arm, the widow felt as if she were moving through a dream. Each step carried her further from the woman she had been just moments before, the widow who counted every grain and measured every drop with careful precision. In her place walked someone new, someone who had chosen to believe in possibilities beyond her comprehension, someone who had decided to trust in the word of the God of Israel. The streets of Zarephath seemed different as she made her way home, though nothing had physically changed. The same dust swirled in the same corners. The same shuttered windows spoke of the same hardships. The same groups of women clustered in the same shaded spots to share the same whispered concerns about their dwindling supplies. Yet something fundamental had shifted in her perception, as if the very air hummed with potential that had not been there before. Her small house sat tucked between two larger dwellings, its modest courtyard barely large enough for a cooking fire and a few clay pots. This had been her world for the past several years, ever since her husband's death had left her to navigate the complexities of widowhood in a society that offered few options for women alone. She had made it a good life, as much as circumstances allowed, filling it with the laughter of her son and the quiet satisfactions of careful management and creative resourcefulness. The widow's son looked up from his place in the corner of their small room as she entered, his dark eyes reflecting both curiosity and the patient resignation of a child who had learned not to expect too much from each day. He was perhaps 10 years old, though the recent months of reduced meals had given him the solemn demeanor of someone much older. His clothes, carefully mended and remended, hung loose on his thin frame, but his mother had managed to keep them clean and whole, maintaining their dignity even in the face of growing poverty. "Mother," he said quietly, setting aside the small piece of wood he had been whittling with his father's old knife. "You seem different. Has something happened?" How perceptive children could be, she thought, even when the world around them made little sense. She paused in the doorway, still clutching her bundle of sticks, trying to find words to explain what had just occurred outside the city gates. How could she tell him that she had promised their last meal to a stranger, based on nothing more than a promise that defied everything they knew about how the world worked? "There is a prophet," she said finally, moving to the corner where their precious supplies were kept. "A man of the God of Israel, and he has asked for food." She knelt beside the large clay jar that held their remaining flour, running her hands along its familiar curves. How many times had she reached into its depths over the years, pulling out the makings of countless meals, never thinking that one day she would scrape its bottom for the final handful. Her son rose and came to stand beside her, his small hand resting gently on her shoulder. "The last of our flour?" he asked, his voice steady despite the implications of the question. He had understood their situation for weeks now, had watched her careful portioning, and seen the worry in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. "Yes," she replied, surprised by the peace in her own voice. "But he has made a promise, that if we share what we have, the flour will not run out, nor will our oil fail, until the rains come again." She looked up into her son's face, seeing there a reflection of her own impossible hope mixed with the practical skepticism they had both learned through hard experience. The boy was quiet for a long moment, considering this. Finally, he nodded. Then we should try, shouldn't we? We were going to eat it all today anyway, and then... He shrugged, leaving the obvious conclusion unspoken. Perhaps the God of Israel has better plans than we do. Out of the mouths of babes, she thought, marveling at the simple wisdom of her child. Together, they began the familiar process of preparing bread, though this time every movement carried extra significance. She reached into the flour jar, her fingers expecting to find only the bottom, but instead encountered what felt like the same small handful she had measured so carefully that morning. Curious, she scooped out what she needed for a small cake, then peered into the jar. There, clinging to the sides and bottom, was exactly what she would have expected. The remnants of what had once been their precious store of grain. Nothing had visibly changed, yet she had been able to remove enough flour for baking without the jar appearing any emptier than before. Her heart began to beat faster as she moved to the oil container, a smaller vessel that had held the last precious drops of what had once been a full supply. The oil poured out golden and smooth, exactly the amount she needed, leaving the jar appearing just as it had moments before. Nearly empty, yet somehow sufficient. With trembling hands, she mixed the flour and oil with a small amount of water, her movements automatic despite the wonder that was building in her chest. The dough formed perfectly under her fingers, neither too dry nor too wet, as if the proportions had been measured by someone with far greater skill than her own. She shaped it into a small, flat cake and placed it on the heated stone over their modest fire. The smell of baking bread filled their small dwelling, an aroma that had become precious and rare in recent months. As the cake cooked, the widow and her son sat in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what was happening, what it might mean, and whether they dared to believe in the impossible promise they had been given. When the bread was ready, golden and fragrant, she carefully lifted it from the stone and placed it in a clean cloth. "I will take this to the prophet," she said, "and then we will see if his God is truly as powerful as he claims." The walk back to the city gate felt different this time, charged with anticipation and wonder. She carried not just bread, but the weight of possibility, the chance that everything she had accepted about their fate might be about to change. The other women she passed in the streets might have seen only a widow carrying a small cake and a cup of water, but she felt as if she bore treasures beyond measure. The prophet waited exactly where she had left him, standing in the shade of the wall with the patient stillness of one accustomed to trusting in divine timing. When he saw her approaching, his weathered face broke into a gentle smile that transformed his entire appearance, making him seem less like a fearsome man of God and more like a kind uncle welcoming a beloved niece. "Here's the bread you requested," she said, offering him the cloth-wrapped cake and the cup of water she had drawn from their carefully guarded supply. "And may your God prove true to his promise." The prophet accepted the offerings with both hands, his touch brief but somehow conveying a blessing that she felt more than understood. "He will," he said simply, breaking off a piece of the bread and eating it with obvious pleasure. "This is good bread, made with skillful hands and offered with a generous heart. The Lord sees both the gift and the spirit in which it is given." As he ate and drank, the widow found herself studying his face, trying to understand what sort of man could inspire such confidence in impossible things. He was not young, though not truly old either, his hair and beard showing the silver threads of middle age. His hands were strong and calloused, the hands of someone who had worked with them. Yet there was something in his manner that spoke of learning and wisdom beyond the ordinary. "Tell me," she said suddenly, surprised by her own boldness, "what is it like to speak with the God of Israel? How do you know when his voice is real and not merely your own thoughts or desires?" The prophet paused in his eating, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. "When the Lord speaks," he said finally, "it is like recognizing the voice of someone you know better than yourself, yet discovering depths you had never imagined. His words carry their own authenticity. They transform not just circumstances, but the very heart of the one who hears them." He gestured toward the bread in his hands. "You trusted today not because you understood, but because something within you recognized truth when it was spoken. That recognition is itself a gift from the Almighty, a sign that he has purposes for you beyond what you can see." The widow nodded, feeling a strange warmth spreading through her chest. She had indeed recognized something in his words, something that had compelled her to act against all practical wisdom. "I should return to my son," she said. "He waits to see if we too will eat today." "Go in peace," the prophet replied. "And remember, the God of Israel keeps his promises, not just for today, but for all the days to come." As she walked back through the dusty streets of Zarephath, the widow's mind raced with possibilities and questions. What would she find when she returned to their flour jar and oil container? Would the miracle the prophet had promised already be evident? Or would she need to continue acting in faith day by day until its reality became undeniable? Her son was waiting by the fire when she entered their home, his face alert with curiosity and hope. "Well?" he asked simply. Instead of answering with words, she moved to their supply corner and reached into the flour jar. Her fingers encountered the same small handful she had found there before, no more, no less. Yet when she scooped it out, there was still flour clinging to the sides of the container, just as there had been earlier. She moved to the oil jar and tipped it carefully. The golden liquid flowed out in exactly the amount she needed, leaving the container appearing unchanged, nearly empty, yet somehow sufficient. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared another cake, this one for herself and her son to share. "Mother," her boy said softly, "is this what a miracle looks like?" She paused in her kneading, considering his question. "I think," she said slowly, "that miracles rarely look like we expect them to. They don't always arrive with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they come as quietly as flour that doesn't run out, or oil that continues to pour when it should be gone." As the second cake baked over their fire, filling their home once again with the wonderful smell of bread, both mother and son began to understand that their lives had taken a turn into territory neither of them had ever imagined. They were no longer simply survivors counting their last resources, but participants in something far larger than themselves, a demonstration of divine provision that would sustain not only their bodies, but their growing faith in the God of Israel. That evening, as they shared their meal in the gathering dusk, the widow found herself offering a prayer of thanks to a deity she was only beginning to know. The bread was good, satisfying in a way that went beyond mere physical nourishment. and in the distance she could hear the gentle sound of the prophet moving about in the small upper room she had offered him for his stay. Tomorrow would bring its own tests and revelations, but tonight, for the first time in months, she and her son went to sleep with full bellies and hearts that dared to hope for a future they could not yet see, but were learning to trust. Days of abundance. The rhythm of days that followed took on a quality unlike anything the widow had ever experienced. Each morning she would wake with a mixture of anticipation and lingering disbelief, hurrying to check their precious supplies before her son stirred from his sleeping mat. And each morning the miracle presented itself anew. Flour clinging to the sides of their storage jar in exactly the same small amount. Oil resting in the bottom of its container like liquid gold. Sufficient for the day's needs, yet never appearing to increase beyond what had been there the day before. It was, she realized, a miracle of perfect proportions, giving them neither abundance to make them careless, nor scarcity to make them fearful. Day by day, meal by meal, they learned to trust in provision that came not in great waves, but in gentle, consistent tides that matched their needs exactly. The prophet Elijah proved to be a guest unlike any she had ever imagined. He was quiet and respectful, helping with small tasks around their modest dwelling, mending a loose stone in their courtyard wall, repairing the handle of a broken water jug with the skill of someone accustomed to living simply and making do with what was at hand. Yet there was something about his presence that transformed their small home into a place of peace and purpose. Her son had taken to the prophet immediately, drawn perhaps by the gentle attention Elijah paid to his questions and observations. In the evenings, when their simple work was done, and the three of them would sit in their courtyard watching the stars emerge in the clear sky, the boy would pepper their guest with endless curiosities about the world beyond Zarephath's walls. "Have you really seen fire fall from heaven?" her son asked one evening, his young voice filled with wonder and just a touch of the skepticism that was natural to children who had learned to question the stories adults told them. Elijah smiled, his weathered hands folded peacefully in his lap. "I have seen many wonders," he replied, "but the greatest miracle is not fire from the sky or ravens bringing food to a hungry prophet. The greatest miracle is when the human heart learns to trust in the goodness of the Almighty, even when circumstances suggest there is no reason for hope." The boy considered this seriously, as he did most things. "Like mother trusting you with our last flour." "Exactly like that," Elijah confirmed, his eyes finding the widow's face across the small space. "Your mother showed more courage in that moment than most warriors display in battle. She chose faith over fear, generosity over hoarding, trust over despair. That is the soil in which miracles grow." The widow felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had never thought of herself as particularly brave or faithful, had seen her decision to share their last meal more as desperate hope than heroic action. But perhaps that was what courage really looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly despite it. As weeks passed, the reality of their sustained provision began to settle into something approaching normalcy, though the wonder of it never completely faded. The widow found herself moving through her days with a lightness she hadn't felt since her husband's death, her step quicker, her smile coming more readily when neighbors passed by their courtyard gate. Other women in Zarephath had begun to notice the change in her appearance. Where once she had carried the gaunt look of someone carefully rationing every morsel, she now showed the healthy glow of regular meals. Her son, too, had filled out, his clothes fitting properly once again, his laughter ringing clear and frequent through their small dwelling. "You look well, Miriam," commented her neighbor Leah one afternoon as they met at the community well. The older woman's eyes held a mixture of genuine pleasure at her friend's improved circumstances and natural curiosity about what might have caused such a change. "Has your situation improved somehow?" The widow, whose name was indeed Miriam, though she had begun to think of herself simply as the widow of Zarephath since the prophet's arrival, paused in drawing water from the well. How could she explain what had happened without sounding either boastful or mad? The truth was so extraordinary that she herself sometimes wondered if she were living in a dream from which she would eventually awaken to find their supplies exhausted and starvation once again stalking their door. "I have taken in a lodger," she said finally, which was true as far as it went. "A traveler who shares the household expenses." It was a carefully crafted half-truth that satisfied the requirements of honesty while protecting the full miracle from casual scrutiny. Leah nodded approvingly. "A wise decision, especially in these difficult times. Though you must be careful, a woman alone with a strange man in the house. People will talk." Miriam smiled, understanding her neighbor's concern, while knowing that such worries were groundless. There was nothing in Elijah's behavior that suggested anything but the highest respect for her position and reputation. Indeed, he had proven more thoughtful and considerate than many of the married men she knew, always asking permission before making even small changes in their routine, always ensuring that his presence added to rather than complicated their household management. "He is a man of God," she replied, and immediately realized that she had revealed more than she intended. But perhaps it was time to begin sharing, carefully and gradually, the truth of what the Lord had done for them. Leah's eyebrows rose with interest. "A holy man? From where does he come?" "From Israel," Miriam said. "He serves the God who made heaven and earth, the one they call the Lord of hosts." The conversation that followed was the first of many as word began to spread quietly through Zarephath that the widow Miriam was hosting a Hebrew prophet, and that her household had somehow found prosperity in the midst of general hardship. Some neighbors responded with skepticism, others with curiosity, and still others with the kind of desperate hope that comes to those who have exhausted all ordinary remedies for their troubles. Elijah himself seemed content to remain largely in the background, appearing when household tasks required an extra hand, or when young Isaac, as Miriam's son was called, sought his company for conversation or simple shared work. But occasionally, when approached directly by people genuinely seeking wisdom or help, the prophet would speak with the authority and compassion that marked his calling. "The God of Israel," he told one group of women who had come to inquire about the faith that seemed to have brought such blessing to Miriam's household, "is not a distant deity concerned only with kings and princes. He sees the sparrow that falls, knows the number of hairs on each head, and hears the prayers of widows and children with the same attention he gives to the mightiest rulers of the earth." These words spread through the community like ripples in a pond, carrying hope to places where hope had long been absent. While few of the local residents were ready to abandon the gods of their ancestors, many began to look toward the Hebrew deity with something approaching respect and cautious optimism. But it was in the quiet moments, the ordinary rhythms of daily life shared between three people who had become an unlikely family, that the deepest transformations occurred. Isaac flourished under the gentle guidance of a man who treated his questions with seriousness and his observations with respect. Miriam found herself learning not just about the God of Israel, but about prayer, about scripture, about the long history of a people who had learned to find their identity in relationship with the Almighty, rather than in the ordinary securities of nation and wealth. In the evenings, when their simple meal was finished and the fire burned low in their small courtyard, Elijah would sometimes tell them stories of the great men and women of faith who had gone before, of Abraham leaving his homeland to follow God's call into the unknown, of Moses standing before Pharaoh with nothing but a wooden staff and divine authority, of David facing giants with only a sling and perfect trust in the Lord's deliverance. Faith, he told them during one such evening, is not the absence of questions or doubts. Faith is the decision to act on what you know to be true about God's character, even when circumstances seem to argue against his goodness or power. Isaac, now filling out with regular meals and glowing with health, leaned forward with the intensity that marked all his conversations with their remarkable guest. But how do you know what's true about God? How can you be certain that what you believe isn't just wishful thinking? It was a profound question from such a young person, and Elijah treated it with the respect it deserved. "Look around you," he said, gesturing toward their home, toward Miriam's face, toward the boy's own renewed vitality. "Does this look like wishful thinking? The flour that doesn't run out, the oil that continues to flow, the way your mother's countenance has changed from despair to hope. These are not accidents or coincidences. They are the signature of a God who delights in turning impossible situations into demonstrations of his faithfulness." As the seasons slowly turned and their miraculous provision continued day after day, week after week, all three members of this unusual household began to understand that they were participating in something much larger than their individual circumstances. They were living proof of divine faithfulness, a testimony written not on stone tablets, but in the daily experience of ordinary people who had chosen to trust an extraordinary God. Yet, even in the midst of such blessing, none of them could have foreseen the test that was coming, the crisis that would challenge not just their faith, but their very understanding of what it meant to trust in the goodness of the Almighty when faced with what appeared to be devastating loss. The morning that changed everything began like any other in their transformed household. Isaac woke with the boundless energy that had returned to him over the months of regular meals and the secure love of a mother no longer consumed with worry about their next morsel of food. The sun streamed through their small window, painting golden rectangles on the packed earth floor, and the familiar sounds of the city awakening drifted over their courtyard walls. Miriam rose early, as had become her custom, to check their miraculous supplies and prepare the morning meal. The flour jar yielded its faithful portion. The oil flowed exactly as needed, and soon the aroma of fresh bread filled their dwelling. These daily confirmations of God's provision had become as natural as breathing, yet she never failed to whisper a prayer of gratitude as she worked. Isaac had developed the habit of helping Elijah with small tasks around their home and neighborhood. Today, the prophet had planned to repair a section of wall for an elderly widow who lived alone several streets away. The boy delighted in these opportunities to learn practical skills while simultaneously witnessing acts of quiet service that never sought recognition or reward. "Come, young Isaac," Elijah called as they finished their morning meal. "Let us go see what good we can accomplish for our neighbors today." The boy jumped up eagerly, but as he rose, Miriam noticed something that made her heart skip slightly. Isaac's face looked flushed, and when he moved toward the door, his steps seemed less steady than usual. She watched him more carefully as he gathered the tools they would need, noting a slight tremor in his hands and the way he paused to catch his breath after what should have been simple exertion. "Isaac," she called gently, "are you feeling well this morning?" Her son turned toward her with a smile that was meant to be reassuring, but somehow fell short of its intended effect. "I'm fine, Mother. Just excited to help with the work today." But as the morning progressed and they worked on their neighbor's wall, Isaac's condition became increasingly apparent. His usual enthusiasm gave way to listlessness, his helpful energy replaced by a growing pallor that worried both Miriam and Elijah. By midday, the boy was struggling to keep up with tasks that would normally have been easy for him. "Perhaps we should return home," Elijah suggested quietly to Miriam when Isaac sat down heavily in the shade, his breathing labored and his skin taking on an alarming grayish tint. "The boy needs rest." The walk home that should have taken only minutes stretched into a slow, careful journey as Isaac's strength continued to ebb. Miriam found herself supporting her son's weight, her mind racing with possibilities and fears she tried desperately to suppress. This was just fatigue, she told herself. Perhaps he had been working too hard, or the heat was affecting him more than usual. Surely a good rest in the cool of their home would restore him. But as the hours passed, it became clear that this was no ordinary illness. Isaac's fever climbed steadily, bringing with it waves of delirium that left him calling out for people who weren't there, speaking to faces only he could see. His breathing grew increasingly labored, each breath requiring effort that should have come naturally and easily. Miriam sat beside his sleeping mat, cooling his fevered brow with damp cloths and whispering prayers that grew more desperate as the day wore on. Elijah moved quietly around their dwelling, helping where he could, but she could see in his eyes the same growing concern that was consuming her own heart. As evening approached, Isaac's condition worsened dramatically. The strong, healthy boy who had laughed and worked alongside them that very morning now lay pale and still, his breath coming in shallow, irregular gasps that seemed to grow fainter with each passing hour. Miriam held his burning hand in both of hers, willing her own strength to flow into his failing body, begging the God who had provided flour and oil to now provide healing for her precious son. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of her desperation. "Lord God of Israel, you have shown your power in our home. You have provided when we had nothing, sustained us when death seemed certain. Please, please heal my son." But even as she prayed, she could feel Isaac slipping away, his grip on her hand growing weaker, his breathing more labored. The boy who had been her joy, her reason for continuing through the darkest days of their poverty, was fading before her eyes despite all the miracles they had witnessed, despite all the faith they had learned to exercise. Elijah knelt beside them, his weathered hands gentle on the boy's fevered head. The prophet's face was etched with grief and something else, a deep, troubled confusion that spoke of questions for which he had no ready answers. Here was a man who had seen fire fall from heaven, who had been fed by ravens and sustained by miraculous provision, yet who now seemed as helpless as any ordinary person in the face of approaching tragedy. Throughout the long night, they maintained their vigil, taking turns cooling Isaac's fever, adjusting his position to help his breathing, whispering prayers and encouragements that seemed to dissolve into the darkness without effect. Miriam found herself bargaining with God, offering anything and everything she could think of in exchange for her son's life, her own health, her own years, even the miraculous provision they had enjoyed if only Isaac could be spared. As dawn approached, painting their small windows with pale light, Isaac's breathing grew so faint as to be barely perceptible. His hand in hers was hot and dry, his face peaceful but alarmingly still. Miriam felt panic rising in her chest like floodwater, threatening to sweep away the faith that had sustained her through so many challenges. "Elijah," she whispered urgently, "surely God will not take him now, after all he has done for us. Surely this is not how the story ends." The prophet's eyes were filled with tears she had never seen before, and for the first time since she had known him, he seemed to have no words of comfort or assurance to offer. The silence that stretched between them was heavy with unspoken fears and questions that challenged everything they thought they understood about God's goodness and faithfulness. Then, as the first full rays of sunlight entered their dwelling, Isaac drew what appeared to be his final breath. The shallow, labored respirations that had marked the night simply stopped, leaving behind a stillness that was both peaceful and devastating. The boy who had filled their home with laughter and questions, who had embraced the prophet's presence with such joy, who had grown strong and healthy on miraculous provision, lay motionless on his sleeping mat. Miriam's scream of anguish tore through the morning quiet, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. All the faith she had carefully built, all the trust she had learned to place in the God of Israel, all the peace she had found in his provision, everything crumbled in that moment like a wall built of sand facing an overwhelming tide. "What have you done to me, O man of God?" she cried, her words a mixture of grief and accusation that she couldn't contain. "Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" The question hung in the air between them like a sword, cutting through the gentle fellowship they had shared for so many months. In her anguish, all the old fears and superstitions of her upbringing came flooding back. The belief that suffering was punishment, that tragedy was evidence of divine displeasure, that the presence of a holy man might somehow attract God's judgment upon hidden sins she had forgotten or never recognized. Elijah received her accusation without defense or argument, his own grief evident in every line of his weathered face. He looked down at Isaac's still form, this boy who had become like a son to him, whose questions and enthusiasm had brought such joy to their unusual household. The prophet's shoulders shook with silent sobs as he grappled not only with personal loss, but with the theological crisis that Isaac's death represented. here was the God who had provided flour and oil without fail, who had sustained them through months of drought and famine, who had shown his power and faithfulness in countless ways. Yet this same God had apparently allowed, or perhaps even caused, the death of an innocent child in a home where his prophet dwelt, where his provision had been faithfully received and gratefully acknowledged day after day. The morning sun continued to stream through their windows, indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded in their small dwelling. Outside, the sounds of Zarephath awakening to another day of drought and hardship provided a cruel counterpoint to the stillness that had settled over Isaac's motionless form. The ordinary world continued its ordinary rhythms, while inside their home, two people who had learned to believe in extraordinary possibilities now faced a test that would challenge the very foundations of everything they thought they knew about faith, hope, and the character of the God they had chosen to trust. Yet in the midst of her overwhelming grief, even as the words of accusation still echoed in the air between them, some deep part of Miriam's spirit recognized that this was not the end of the story. The same God who had provided miraculous flour and oil, who had sent his prophet to her door at just the right moment, who had sustained them through impossible circumstances. This God was not finished writing the chapters of their lives. The desperate prayer. Elijah rose slowly from where he knelt beside Isaac's still form, his movements heavy with grief and a weight of responsibility that seemed to press down upon his shoulders like a physical burden. The prophet's eyes, usually bright with the confidence of one who walked closely with the Almighty, now held a deep anguish that spoke of questions for which he had no immediate answers, of faith being tested in ways he had not anticipated. Without a word, he gently lifted Isaac's lifeless body from the sleeping mat where the boy had breathed his last. The child who had been so full of vitality and curiosity just hours before now lay limp and still in the prophet's arms, his face peaceful but utterly absent of the spark that had made him so delightful to know and love. Miriam watched through her tears as Elijah cradled her son with infinite tenderness, his weathered hands supporting the boy's head and limbs, as if Isaac were merely sleeping and might wake at any moment. There was something in the prophet's manner that spoke not of surrender to tragedy, but of determination in the face of what appeared to be insurmountable loss. "Give me your son," Elijah said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion, but carrying an undertone of authority that had not been there moments before. It was not a request so much as a gentle command, spoken with the kind of certainty that had marked his original promise about the flour and oil that would not fail. Something in his tone penetrated through Miriam's grief and confusion, offering her a thread of hope so fragile she almost feared to grasp it. Through her tears, she watched as Elijah turned toward the narrow stairs that led to the small upper room where he had made his dwelling for these many months. His steps were measured and purposeful, each footfall seeming to echo with the weight of divine encounter that was about to unfold. The upper room had always been a place of prayer for the prophet. Miriam had often heard the gentle murmur of his voice in the early morning hours and late in the evening, carrying on conversations with his God that seemed to sustain him through each day. Now, as she listened from below, the familiar sounds of prayer took on a new urgency and intensity that made the very air in their dwelling feel charged with anticipation. Elijah laid Isaac's body carefully on his own sleeping mat, arranging the boy's limbs with the same care he had shown in life, smoothing back the dark hair from the child's forehead. For a moment, he simply stood looking down at the still form, his heart breaking not only for the loss of this precious young life, but for the pain he knew was consuming Miriam's soul in the room below. Then, with movements that spoke of desperate determination, the prophet prostrated himself fully upon the lifeless body of the child, pressing his own living warmth against the cold stillness that death had brought. It was an act of profound intimacy and faith, a physical demonstration of his refusal to accept that this was how Isaac's story was meant to end. "O Lord my God," he cried out, his voice carrying all the anguish and confusion that filled his heart, "have you also brought tragedy to the widow with whom I lodge, by killing her son?" The words echoed in the small room like an accusation and a plea combined. The cry of a man who had devoted his life to serving God, yet who now found himself confronting what appeared to be divine cruelty toward the very people his presence was supposed to bless. How could the God who had provided flour and oil without fail now take the life of the innocent child who had received those gifts with such joy and gratitude? But even as he voiced these questions, Elijah's heart knew that this was not a time for theological debate or careful reasoning. This was a moment for the kind of bold, desperate faith that had marked the greatest heroes of their people. The faith of Abraham pleading for Sodom, of Moses interceding for rebellious Israel, of Jacob wrestling with the angel and refusing to let go until he received a blessing. Stretching himself upon the child a second time, Elijah poured out his heart in prayer that went beyond words, beyond rational argument, beyond everything except raw trust in the character of the God he had served for so many years. "O Lord my God," he pleaded, "I pray let this child's soul come back to him." The request was audacious beyond measure, asking for nothing less than the reversal of death itself, the restoration of life to flesh that had already begun to grow cold. It was the kind of prayer that seemed to mock the natural order of things, that challenged the very boundaries between the possible and impossible. Yet Elijah prayed it with the same confidence he had once shown when calling for fire to fall from heaven, the same certainty he had demonstrated when promising that flour and oil would not fail. A third time he stretched himself upon Isaac's still form, his own living breath mingling with the silence that had replaced the boy's gentle respirations. "O Lord my God, let this child's soul come back to him," he cried again, his voice growing stronger rather than weaker with repetition, as if each prayer was building upon the last like stones in a tower reaching toward heaven. In the room below, Miriam could hear every word of the prophet's desperate intercession. Her own grief had evolved from the wild anguish of first loss into something deeper and more complex, a mixture of pain and hope, of doubt and dawning faith, of despair and growing expectation that perhaps, the God who had already worked so many wonders in their household might yet work the greatest wonder of all. She found herself praying too, though her words were jumbled and incoherent, more feeling than language, more yearning than petition. "Please," she whispered over and over. "Please, please, please," the single word carrying all the love and desperation of a mother's heart. Above them, Elijah continued his vigil, his prayers growing more intense rather than less so as time passed. He had entered that mysterious realm where human effort meets divine possibility, where the impossible becomes not just conceivable, but inevitable for those who dare to believe that God's power extends even into the valley of the shadow of death. The prophet's faith was not based on his understanding of how such a miracle might occur, or on his ability to explain the theological implications of resurrection, or on any precedent he could cite from the history of his people. His faith was grounded solely in his knowledge of God's character, a God who delighted in turning hopeless situations into testimonies of his faithfulness, who specialized in doing impossible things for those who trusted him completely. As he prayed, Elijah began to feel something shifting in the spiritual atmosphere around him, a change as subtle as the first breath of wind that precedes a storm, yet as unmistakable as the dawn after the longest night. The coldness that had settled into Isaac's body began to give way to something warmer, some stirring of life that defied every natural law yet answered to the higher law of divine love. And then, like the first flower pushing through winter earth, like the first ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds, like the first note of music after long silence, Isaac drew a breath. It was soft, barely perceptible, yet it was unmistakably real. The return of life to what had been lifeless, the restoration of hope to what had seemed hopeless, the triumph of faith over the apparent finality of death, the restoration. The breath that stirred in Isaac's chest was soft as a whisper, gentle as morning dew, yet it thundered through the small upper room like the voice of the Almighty himself proclaiming victory over the grave. Elijah, still stretched upon the boy's form, felt the subtle movement beneath him before he heard the sound. The almost imperceptible expansion of ribs that had been still, the faint flutter of a heart that had ceased to beat. For a moment, the prophet remained perfectly motionless, afraid that any movement on his part might somehow interrupt the miraculous process that was beginning to unfold. He had prayed with desperate faith, had pleaded with God for the impossible. But now that the impossible was actually happening, he found himself overwhelmed by wonder and gratitude too deep for words. Isaac's second breath was stronger than the first, followed by a third and fourth, each one more natural and regular than the last. Color began to return to the boy's pale cheeks, warmth spreading through limbs that had grown cold and still. His eyelids, which had been closed in the peaceful stillness of death, began to flutter slightly, as if he were waking from an unusually deep sleep. Elijah slowly raised himself from where he lay, his movements careful and reverent, as if he were witnessing the dawn of creation itself. Below them, Miriam had fallen silent, her maternal instincts somehow sensing the change even before her rational mind could process what was happening. The very air in their dwelling seemed to thrum with divine presence, charged with the power that could speak worlds into existence and call the dead back to life. Isaac's eyes opened slowly, blinking against the morning light that streamed through the small window of the upper room. For a moment, confusion flickered across his features as he tried to understand where he was and why the prophet was looking down at him with such intense joy and amazement. The boy's voice, when he finally spoke, was soft but perfectly clear. "Elijah?" he whispered, using the name he had learned to speak with such affection and respect. "What happened? I feel like I've been sleeping for a very long time." The prophet's answering smile was radiant with joy and thanksgiving, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he helped Isaac sit up on the sleeping mat. "You have been sleeping, my boy," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion. "But now you are awake, and all is well." Isaac looked around the familiar room with the slight disorientation of someone emerging from profound rest. He seemed stronger and more alert with each passing moment, his natural vitality returning like water flowing back into a dry riverbed. "I remember being sick," he said, his young brow furrowed with effort as he tried to piece together the fragments of memory. "Mother was taking care of me, and I felt so tired." "You were very ill," Elijah confirmed, helping the boy to his feet. "But the Lord God of Israel has healed you completely. Come, let us go to your mother. She has been greatly worried about you." As they made their way down the narrow stairs, Isaac's steps grew steadier and more confident. By the time they reached the main room of their dwelling, he was moving with almost all of his normal energy and grace, though there was something in his demeanor that spoke of a profound experience he could not quite articulate or fully remember. Miriam looked up from where she sat near the cold fire pit, her face streaked with tears and etched with the kind of grief that ages a person in hours rather than years. When she saw her son walking toward her, alive and whole and smiling, her expression transformed through a series of emotions too rapid and complex to catalog. Disbelief giving way to recognition, recognition blooming into joy, joy exploding into gratitude too vast for any human heart to contain. "Isaac," she cried, leaping to her feet and gathering him into her arms with a fierceness that spoke of a mother's love tested to its absolute limits and emerging victorious. "My son, my precious son." The boy submitted to her embrace with the patient affection of a child who understood, even if he could not fully comprehend, that something momentous had occurred. Over his mother's shoulder, his eyes found Elijah's face, and in that look passed a communication deeper than words, a recognition that they had shared something extraordinary, a bond forged in the mysterious realm where human faith meets divine power. "I'm all right, Mother," Isaac said gently, though he made no move to escape her fierce embrace. "I feel wonderful, better than I've felt in, well, I can't remember ever feeling this good." Indeed, as Miriam held him and examined him with a mother's careful eye, she could see that he was not merely restored to his previous state of health, but seemed somehow enhanced, as if the power that had returned life to his body had perfected and strengthened it in the process. His eyes were brighter, his color more vibrant, his very presence more substantial than it had been even before his illness. Through her tears of joy and relief, Miriam looked toward Elijah with an expression that held gratitude too deep for words, wonder too great for comprehension, and a faith that had been tested to its breaking point, only to emerge refined and purified like gold that has passed through fire. The accusations she had hurled at him in her grief now seemed not just wrong, but almost absurd. How could she have doubted the goodness of a God who would work such a miracle in response to a prophet's prayer? "Now I know that you are a man of God," she said, her voice strong despite the tears that continued to flow, "and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." It was a declaration that went far beyond mere acknowledgement of Elijah's status or authority. It was the testimony of a woman who had seen death conquered, hope restored, and faith vindicated in ways that transcended every natural expectation. She had witnessed not just a healing, but a resurrection, not just a recovery, but a complete triumph over the grave itself. Elijah received her words with humble gratitude, knowing that he had been merely the instrument through which God had chosen to work this wonder. "The Lord is indeed faithful," he replied simply. "He keeps his promises not just for today's bread and tomorrow's oil, but for every need of those who trust in him, even when that need seems greater than life itself." As the three of them sat together in their small dwelling, sharing a simple meal prepared from flour that still did not fail and oil that continued to flow, they understood that they had crossed a threshold into a new kind of faith, one that had been tested by the ultimate trial and had emerged not just intact, but strengthened beyond measure. They were no longer simply recipients of God's daily provision. They were witnesses to his power over death itself, living testimonies to the truth that no situation is too hopeless for divine intervention. The story of Isaac's restoration spread quietly through Zarephath, carried by whispers and careful conversations among people who had learned to hope for miracles in their drought-stricken city. Some dismissed it as exaggeration or wishful thinking, but others, those whose own desperate circumstances had prepared them to believe in impossible possibilities, heard in the tale an echo of hope that their own prayers might also be answered in ways beyond their imagining. But the greatest impact of the miracle was not on the wider community, profound as that was. The greatest change was in the hearts and souls of three people who had discovered that faith was not just about trusting God for daily bread or basic provision, but about believing that his love and power extended into every realm of human experience, including the darkest valley of loss and grief. As evening settled over their transformed household, with Isaac healthy and strong beside the fire, and Elijah speaking quietly of the great faithfulness of God, Miriam found herself understanding that they had been chosen not just to receive miracles, but to demonstrate them to a world that had almost forgotten how to hope. Their story was being written not just for their own benefit, but as a testimony to future generations about the character of a God who specializes in turning endings into beginnings, sorrow into joy, and death itself into the gateway to even greater life. In the days that followed, their routine resumed much as it had before, with flour that never failed and oil that continued to flow, with work shared and meals enjoyed, with evening conversations that deepened their understanding of faith and divine purpose. Yet everything was different now, colored by the knowledge that they had been touched by power that transcended every natural boundary, that had been chosen to participate in a demonstration of love that conquered even death. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between day and night, when the fire burned low in their courtyard and the stars emerged in the clear sky above Zarephath, they would look at each other and remember what it felt like to witness the impossible becoming inevitable, to see faith rewarded beyond every expectation, to discover that the God they served was not just provider of daily needs, but master of life itself. A God whose story was far from finished, whose plans reached far beyond their small household to encompass purposes they were only beginning to glimpse. The mountain challenge. The seasons turned slowly in their household of miracles, each day bringing its familiar rhythm of provision and gratitude, of shared work and evening conversations that deepened their understanding of faith. Isaac grew stronger, not just in body, but in spirit, carrying within him the quiet confidence of one who had been touched by divine power and lived to tell of it. Miriam found her own faith maturing from desperate hope into settled assurance, while Elijah moved through their daily routines with the peaceful authority of a man who had seen God's faithfulness tested and proven true in the most extreme circumstances. But as the months passed, the prophet began to sense a stirring in his spirit, a growing awareness that his time of quiet refuge in Zarephath was drawing to a close. The same voice that had directed him to this foreign shore was beginning to whisper of new challenges, of confrontations that would test not just his own faith, but the faith of an entire nation that had wandered far from the God of their fathers. One morning, as he stood in their small courtyard watching the sun rise over the walls of the city, Elijah heard the call he had been both expecting and dreading. It came not as a thunderous command, but as a gentle certainty that settled into his heart like rain on thirsty ground, yet carried with it the weight of destiny and the promise of conflict. "Go, present yourself to Ahab," came the divine instruction, "and I will send rain on the earth." Rain. The word carried promises and threats in equal measure. Rain would mean the end of the drought that had gripped the land for 3 long years, the restoration of prosperity and hope to a suffering people. But rain would also mean the end of his time with Miriam and Isaac, the conclusion of this chapter of quiet miracles and growing faith, the beginning of a new and far more public demonstration of divine power. Elijah shared the news with his adopted family over their morning meal, watching their faces as understanding dawned that their time together was approaching its end. Isaac, now completely restored to health and strength, listened with the serious attention he gave to all matters of importance, while Miriam's expression showed the complex mixture of joy and sorrow that comes when God's purposes require difficult partings. "You must go where the Lord directs," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears that gathered in her eyes. "We have learned much about obedience from watching you, and we know that God's plans are always greater than our own preferences or comfort." The preparations for departure were simple, for Elijah had arrived with little and would leave with little, carrying only what was necessary for the journey and the confrontation that awaited him. Yet the true preparations were of the heart and spirit, the internal gathering of faith and courage needed to face a king who had spent 3 years blaming the prophet for the drought, and prophets of false gods who had spent the same years claiming power they could not demonstrate. On his final morning in Zarephath, Elijah rose before dawn and climbed to the flat roof of their house, looking out over the city that had sheltered him and toward the land of Israel that lay beyond the horizon. Somewhere in that distant country, King Ahab was preparing for what he did not know would be a day of reckoning, while the people of the northern kingdom continued their confused allegiance to gods who promised much but delivered nothing. As the sun painted the eastern sky with gold and crimson, Miriam and Isaac joined him on the rooftop for their final meal together. They ate in companionable silence, each lost in thoughts of gratitude and anticipation, of sorrow at parting and excitement about what God might do next. The bread was still warm from the oven, made from flour that had never failed, prepared with oil that continued to flow just as the Lord had promised. "The provision will continue," Elijah assured them, though they had not asked for such reassurance. "What God has begun in this household, he will sustain. The flour and oil are symbols of his faithfulness, but the reality they represent, his commitment to care for those who trust him, that will never fail, whether I am here or far away. Isaac reached across their simple meal to take the prophet's weathered hand. "Will we see you again?" he asked with the directness that had always characterized their conversations. Elijah smiled, though his eyes held the uncertainty of one who served a God whose ways often surprised even his most faithful servants. "I do not know what the Lord has planned beyond today's obedience," he replied honestly. "But I know this. The bonds we have formed here go deeper than physical presence. You will carry with you always the memory of what God has done in this place, and that memory will strengthen your faith in whatever circumstances you may face." As the time for departure arrived, they gathered in their small courtyard for a final prayer. Elijah placed his hands on Isaac's head, speaking a blessing that seemed to carry the weight of prophetic authority. "May the Lord God of Israel be your strength and shield," he prayed. "May his provision never fail you, and may you always remember that you have seen his power over life and death itself." For Miriam, his words carried both blessing and commission. "You have shown more faith than many who call themselves believers," he told her. "Continue to trust, continue to hope, and know that your story will be told wherever people need to hear that God can transform desperation into abundance, sorrow into joy, death itself into new life." The actual moment of parting was both harder and easier than any of them had expected. Harder because the love they had learned to share was genuine and deep, rooted in shared miracles and daily grace. Easier because they all understood that this separation was not an ending, but a transition, not a loss, but an expansion of God's purposes through their lives. As Elijah walked away from their household, his staff in his hand and his face set toward Israel, he carried with him not just memories, but transformed understanding. The quiet months in Zarephath had been more than refuge from Ahab's wrath. They had been a time of preparation, of learning to trust God not just for dramatic miracles, but for daily faithfulness, not just for public victories, but for private grace. The journey back to Israel took him through familiar landscapes that told the story of 3 years of drought. Wells that had once provided life-giving water now sat empty, their stone walls rising from cracked earth like memorials to better times. Fields that should have been green with growing crops stretched brown and barren to every horizon, while olive groves stood leafless and gray beneath the relentless sun. Yet Elijah walked with confidence, knowing that he carried with him the promise of rain, the assurance that this long season of judgment was about to give way to restoration and renewal. The God who had provided flour and oil without fail in a widow's house was about to demonstrate his power over the very elements themselves, calling down from heaven the rains that would transform the face of the land. As he drew nearer to the territories controlled by King Ahab, the prophet began to encounter other travelers, merchants whose trade had been devastated by the drought, farmers searching desperately for pasture for their dying livestock, families moving from place to place in search of water and food. In their faces he saw the cost of the nation's rebellion against God, the price paid by ordinary people when their leaders chose false gods over the one true deity who alone could send the rains upon which all life depended. But he also saw in some of those faces a readiness for change, a desperation that might finally be willing to hear truth if it were demonstrated with sufficient power and clarity. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would force Israel to choose between the competing claims of their ancestral faith and the attractive but powerless deities their rulers had embraced. Mount Carmel rose before him as he approached the borders of his homeland, its ancient heights calling to mind stories of altars and sacrifices, of divine encounters and holy fire. This mountain, which had witnessed the prayers and offerings of countless generations, was about to become the site of a test that would echo through the ages, a demonstration of divine power that would leave no room for doubt about which God was truly God. The gathering storm Mount Carmel stood against the sky like a sleeping giant, its weathered peaks catching the afternoon light as Elijah approached the sacred ground where heaven and earth seemed to draw closer together. This ancient mountain had witnessed the prayers of countless generations, had felt the weight of altars built and rebuilt, had absorbed the blood of sacrifices offered in hope and desperation and faith. Now it was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would determine the spiritual destiny of a nation. Word of the prophet's return had spread before him like ripples in a pond, carrying news that filled some hearts with hope and others with fear. King Ahab, who had blamed Elijah for 3 years of drought and famine, received reports of the prophet's presence with a mixture of fury and unease. The false prophets who had spent those same years promising rain through their rituals and incantations now faced the prospect of having their claims tested against the power of the God of Israel. As Elijah climbed the familiar paths of Carmel, he could see the evidence of the long drought etched into every landscape. Streams that should have tumbled down the mountainsides lay empty, their rocky beds exposed like bones in the desert sun. Trees that once provided shade and shelter stood leafless and brittle, their branches reaching toward the cloudless sky like the arms of supplicants begging for mercy. Yet the prophet walked with the confidence of one who carried divine authority, who had seen God's faithfulness proven in the most intimate circumstances, and was now prepared to see it demonstrated on the grandest stage. The same power that had provided flour and oil in a widow's jar, that had restored life to a dead child, would now call down fire from heaven and rain from the clouds in full view of all Israel. The word had gone out across the northern kingdom. Every tribe and family was to gather at Mount Carmel to witness a test that would settle, once and for all, the question of which deity deserved their worship and allegiance. They came slowly at first, driven by curiosity and the deep hunger for hope that had sustained them through 3 years of failed harvests and empty wells. But as the appointed day drew near, the trickle became a flood as thousands upon thousands of Israelites made their way to the ancient mountain. King Ahab himself arrived with great pomp and ceremony, his royal entourage a stark contrast to the simple dress and manner of the prophet who had summoned this gathering. The king's face bore the marks of 3 years of frustrated rule, of watching his kingdom wither while the man he blamed for its troubles remained beyond his reach. Now, finally, Elijah had emerged from hiding, and Ahab saw an opportunity for both revenge and vindication. The 450 prophets of Baal came in their own impressive procession, their elaborate robes and ceremonial implements designed to inspire awe and confidence in their divine connections. These were men who had grown accustomed to the favor of the royal court, who had enjoyed the privileges that came with telling rulers what they wanted to hear. Their God, they proclaimed, was the Lord of storms and fertility, the deity who controlled the rains that the land so desperately needed. As the great crowd assembled on the broad plateau of Mount Carmel, the contrast between the two sides could not have been more stark. On one side stood the overwhelming force of official religion, hundreds of prophets backed by royal authority, representing gods whose worship had been established and encouraged throughout the northern kingdom. On the other side stood a single man, weathered by years of wilderness living, carrying nothing but the staff in his hand and the absolute certainty that he served the one true God. The people who had gathered to witness this confrontation represented every level of Israelite society. There were wealthy merchants who had seen their trade routes dry up along with the rivers, farmers whose fields lay barren despite their desperate prayers to whatever gods might listen, mothers who had watched their children grow thin and weak while the promised rains failed to come year after year. Among the crowd were also those whose hearts had never fully abandoned the faith of their fathers, who had watched the rise of Baal worship with growing unease, who remembered stories their grandparents had told of the mighty works of the Lord God of Israel. These faithful remnant had prayed in secret, had maintained their household altars despite royal disapproval, and had waited with increasing hope for some sign that their ancestral deity had not forgotten his covenant people. As the sun reached its zenith and the assembled thousands fell silent, Elijah stepped forward to address the multitude. His voice, trained by years of calling out over desert winds and mountain valleys, carried clearly across the plateau, reaching the ears and hearts of every person gathered on that sacred ground. "How long will you falter between two opinions?" he called out, his words cutting through the expectant silence like a sword through cloth. "If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him." The challenge was direct and uncompromising, offering no middle ground, no comfortable compromise between competing loyalties. For too long, the people had tried to serve both the God of their fathers and the attractive deities their rulers promoted, hedging their spiritual bets by maintaining altars to multiple gods. Now they were being forced to choose, to declare their allegiance in a way that would have immediate and visible consequences. The people's response was telling, a silence that spoke of hearts torn between competing claims, minds confused by years of mixed messages, souls hungry for clarity but afraid of making the wrong choice. They had learned to be cautious in their commitments, to avoid taking stands that might prove costly if circumstances changed. Into this silence, Elijah spoke again, his proposal both simple and audacious. "Therefore, let them give us 2 bulls," he declared, addressing both the prophets of Baal and the assembled multitude. "And let them choose 1 bull for themselves, cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. Then you call on the name of your gods, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God." The terms of the test were elegantly clear. No trickery would be possible, no hidden mechanisms or secret preparations that might account for false miracles. 2 altars would be built in full view of thousands of witnesses. 2 sacrifices would be prepared according to identical specifications. And 2 groups of worshippers would call upon their respective deities to demonstrate divine power by consuming the offerings with fire from heaven. The people's response to this proposal was immediate and enthusiastic. "It is well spoken," they called out, their voices rising in a chorus of approval that spoke of hearts weary of confusion and desperate for clarity. Here, finally, was a test that would settle the question that had plagued their nation for years, not through theological arguments or competing interpretations of ancient texts, but through direct demonstration of divine power. The prophets of Baal, caught up in the momentum of the moment and confident in their God's supposed control over natural forces, accepted the challenge with outward bravado that may have concealed inner uncertainty. They had staked their reputations and positions on Baal's ability to provide rain and prosperity. Surely their deity would vindicate them when called upon in such a public forum. As the afternoon progressed, the 2 altars began to take shape. Stones were gathered and arranged with careful attention to ancient specifications. Wood was collected and arranged to provide fuel for the divine fire that would soon be called down. And the bulls were selected and prepared according to sacrificial protocol that had been handed down through generations. The atmosphere on Mount Carmel grew thick with anticipation as the moment of testing approached. This was no ordinary religious ceremony or routine sacrifice, but a watershed moment that would determine the spiritual direction of an entire nation. Children who had known nothing but drought would witness either the vindication of their parents' new gods or the dramatic return of the deity their great-grandparents had worshipped. Among the crowd, hearts were lifted in prayers to whatever gods they trusted, pleas for divine intervention that would demonstrate once and for all where truth lay and which deity deserved their worship. Some prayed to Baal, begging the storm god to show his power over fire as he claimed dominion over rain. Others whispered appeals to the Lord God of Israel, asking the God of Abraham and Moses to remember his covenant people and vindicate his holy name before the nations. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the plateau, the stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the centuries. 2 altars stood ready. 2 sacrifices awaited divine consumption, and thousands of witnesses prepared to see their questions answered not through human wisdom, but through divine power that would leave no room for doubt or compromise. The contest of fire. The moment had arrived for the prophets of Baal to demonstrate the power they had claimed for so long. 450 men, arrayed in their ceremonial robes and carrying the ritual implements of their craft, approached the altar they had built with such care. The bull they had chosen lay prepared upon the wood, ready for the divine fire that would vindicate their God and secure their position in the kingdom they had served with such dedication. "Call on the name of your gods," Elijah invited them, his voice carrying across the plateau with generous courtesy that concealed none of his confidence in the outcome. "You are many, and I am one. It is only fitting that you should have the first opportunity to demonstrate your God's power." The prophets of Baal began their invocation with the formal dignity that marked official religious ceremonies, their voices rising in harmonious chants that had been refined through years of court performance. "O Baal, hear us," they called, their words echoing across the mountain plateau and reaching the ears of the assembled thousands who watched with growing intensity. At first, their prayers maintained the composed authority that had made them influential in King Ahab's court. These were men accustomed to leading worship, confident in their rituals, secure in their understanding of divine protocols. They called upon Baal by his various names and titles: Lord of Storms, Master of Fertility, Commander of the Heavens, Provider of Rain, each invocation accompanied by gestures and movements that spoke of long practice and deep conviction. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and the hour stretched toward 2, the sacrifice remained untouched by any divine flame. The wood lay dry and cold beneath the carefully prepared offering, showing no sign of the supernatural fire that should have consumed it in dramatic vindication of their God's reality and power. The prophets' voices began to strain with effort and growing desperation as they repeated their appeals with increasing urgency. "O Baal, answer us," they cried, their harmonious chanting giving way to more individual and passionate pleas. Some began to dance around the altar, their movements becoming more frenzied as they sought to attract their deity's attention through increasingly elaborate displays of devotion. Others raised their voices to levels that carried across the entire gathering, their words becoming harsh with strain as they begged for divine intervention. The assembled crowd watched this display with emotions that shifted gradually from expectation to confusion to growing unease. Many had genuinely hoped to see Baal demonstrate his power, not from any hatred of the God of Israel, but from simple desire to know which deity could actually provide the help their drought-stricken land so desperately needed. As the hours passed without result, hope began to give way to doubt, and doubt to a dawning realization that perhaps their confidence had been misplaced. By midday, when the sun stood directly overhead and the heat on the mountain plateau had become oppressive, the prophets of Baal had abandoned all pretense of dignified ceremony. They leapt about their altar with wild abandon, their careful choreography replaced by desperate improvisations designed to provoke some response from their apparently absent God. Their voices, now hoarse from hours of calling, cracked as they shouted increasingly frantic appeals. It was then that Elijah, who had been watching their efforts with patient silence, began to offer commentary that cut through their desperation with devastating clarity. "Cry aloud," he called to them, his voice carrying the dry humor of one who knew the inevitable outcome. For he is a God. Either he is meditating, or he is busy, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. The prophet's words carried across the plateau like arrows finding their mark, each suggestion highlighting the absurdity of a God who might be distracted, absent, or unconscious at the very moment when his people needed him most. The listening crowd began to murmur among themselves, some laughing despite their tension, others shaking their heads as they began to understand the implications of what they were witnessing. Stung by Elijah's mockery, but driven by desperation beyond shame, the prophets of Baal escalated their efforts to extremes that revealed the depth of their panic. Following practices that were common in their tradition when normal appeals failed, they began to cut themselves with knives and lances, their blood flowing freely as they offered their own pain as sacrifice to motivate their deity's response. "Answer us, O Baal," they screamed, their voices raw and breaking, their bodies streaming with self-inflicted wounds that spoke of devotion pushed beyond rational limits. Show your power, vindicate your servants, prove your reality before this multitude. But the altar remained cold and lifeless, the sacrifice untouched by any flame except the natural heat of the sun beating down upon the mountain plateau. No voice answered from heaven. No fire descended to consume the offering. No sign appeared to validate the faith of those who had staked everything on Baal's ability to demonstrate divine power when directly challenged. As the afternoon wore on toward evening, the prophet's efforts grew ever more desperate and disorganized. Some continued their frenzied dancing, though their movements had lost all grace and purpose, becoming mere flailing expressions of futility. Others maintained their shouting, though their voices were now barely recognizable, reduced to hoarse croaks that carried more pain than faith. The watching crowd had grown increasingly quiet as the hours passed, their initial excitement giving way to uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing not divine vindication, but human humiliation on a massive scale. Children pressed closer to their parents, disturbed by the sight of adults behaving with such desperate abandon. Adults exchanged worried glances as they began to understand that the religious authorities they had trusted were proving powerless when put to a genuine test. By late afternoon, when the time for the evening sacrifice approached, according to ancient custom, even the most dedicated prophets of Baal had begun to acknowledge defeat through their actions, if not their words. Their voices had failed them. Their bodies were exhausted from hours of frenzied activity, and their God had remained stubbornly silent despite every appeal they could devise. "Enough," Elijah called out, his voice carrying easily across the plateau despite its conversational tone. "You have had your opportunity, and your God has had his chance. Now let all the people come near to me, and let the God of Israel demonstrate his reality and power." The transition from the chaos surrounding Baal's altar to the ordered preparations around Elijah's was so marked that even those who had remained skeptical of the prophet could not fail to notice the difference. Where the prophets of Baal had worked themselves into frenzy, Elijah moved with calm deliberation. Where they had shouted themselves hoarse, he spoke with quiet authority that somehow carried further than their loudest cries. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky with gold and crimson that seemed to promise the divine fire that was about to fall, the stage was set for a demonstration of power that would transform not just the immediate circumstances, but the spiritual understanding of everyone gathered on that sacred mountain. The long day of futile appeals was about to give way to a moment of divine intervention that would leave no doubt about which God was worthy of worship, trust, and obedience. The answer of fire. As the crowd pressed closer to witness what would unfold at Elijah's altar, the prophet began his preparations with movements that spoke of deep reverence, combined with absolute confidence. Unlike the frenzied desperation that had characterized the prophets of Baal, Elijah's actions carried the calm authority of one who knew he was about to participate in divine vindication rather than merely hope for it. The first task was to repair the altar of the Lord that had been broken down, a symbolic act that spoke of restoration not just of stone and mortar, but of proper worship and covenant relationship. Elijah selected 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, building not merely a platform for sacrifice, but a monument to the unity and identity of God's chosen people. Each stone seemed to carry weight beyond its physical mass, representing generations of faith, centuries of covenant promises, and the unbreakable bond between the Almighty and the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As he worked, the prophet's movements were watched by thousands of eyes, each observer trying to understand what made this lone man so confident when hundreds of professional religious leaders had failed so completely. There was something in Elijah's bearing that spoke of intimate knowledge rather than desperate hope, of certainty born from personal experience rather than theoretical faith. Having completed the altar, Elijah arranged the wood with the same careful attention to detail that marked every aspect of his preparation. This was no hasty construction designed merely to provide fuel for hoped-for divine fire, but a deliberate creation that would serve as a proper foundation for the sacrifice the Lord was about to receive. The pieces were laid with precision, creating spaces for air to flow while providing substantial material for the flames that would soon consume not only the wood, but the offering itself. The bull was prepared according to ancient specifications that had been handed down through generations of faithful worshippers, each cut and arrangement following protocols that connected this moment to countless previous encounters between God and his people. Yet even as Elijah followed traditional procedures, there was something in his manner that suggested he was preparing for something unprecedented, something that would surpass every previous demonstration of divine power. Then, to the amazement of all who watched, Elijah commanded that 4 water pots be filled from the sea and poured over the entire sacrifice. The precious liquid, made even more valuable by 3 years of drought, flowed over the meat and wood, soaking everything thoroughly until the altar seemed more prepared for drowning than burning. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd as they watched this apparently counterproductive action. "Do it a second time," Elijah commanded, and the water carriers obediently repeated their task, pouring out another 4 containers of seawater until the sacrifice was even more thoroughly soaked, the wood dark with moisture, the altar stones glistening wet in the afternoon sun. The audience's confusion deepened as they tried to understand why the prophet would make his task even more impossible than it had already appeared to be. "Do it a third time," came the prophet's final instruction, and for the 3rd time, precious water was poured over the already saturated sacrifice until it ran off the altar and filled a trench that had been dug around the entire structure. What had begun as a normal preparation for sacrifice had become something that seemed to mock the very possibility of fire, as if Elijah were deliberately ensuring that no natural flame could possibly take hold. The sun was now approaching the western horizon, painting Mount Carmel with golden light that would soon give way to evening shadows. The time for the daily sacrifice had arrived, that sacred moment when faithful worshippers throughout the land would normally offer their evening prayers and oblations to the Almighty. It was a time traditionally associated with divine favor and answered prayer, yet never had so much depended on heaven's response to earthly appeal. Elijah stepped forward, his weathered face turned toward heaven, his hands raised not in the frantic gestures that had characterized the prophets of Baal, but in the calm posture of one approaching a beloved friend. when he spoke, his voice carried across the plateau with clarity and power, yet held none of the desperation that had marked the earlier failed appeals. "Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he prayed, invoking the ancient names that connected this moment to the very foundations of their faith. "Let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word." The prayer was remarkably brief, especially compared to the hours of pleading that had preceded it. Yet every word carried weight that seemed to press against the very boundaries between heaven and earth. This was not the appeal of uncertainty, hoping for divine favor, but the request of a faithful servant asking his master to fulfill a promise already given, to complete a plan already set in motion. "Hear me, O Lord, hear me," Elijah continued, his voice growing stronger rather than weaker as he spoke, "that this people may know that you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you." The final words had barely left the prophet's lips when the answer came with a completeness that exceeded every expectation and silenced every doubt. Fire fell from heaven like a blazing arrow shot by the Almighty himself, striking the water-soaked altar with power that transformed the entire scene in an instant. The flames that descended were unlike any earthly fire, burning with intensity that consumed not just the sacrifice and wood, but the very stones of the altar and the water in the surrounding trench. The divine fire burned with such complete thoroughness that nothing remained of the sacrifice but the memory of what had been offered and received. The bull, the wood, the stones, the dust, even the water that had seemed to make combustion impossible, all were consumed by flames that spoke of power beyond natural understanding, of a God whose authority extended over every element of creation. The assembled thousands fell on their faces as one, overwhelmed by a demonstration of divine reality that left no room for doubt or hesitation. "The Lord, He is God," they cried out, their voices joining in a confession that rang across the mountain plateau like thunder. "The Lord, He is God." The words were repeated again and again, becoming a thunderous chorus that seemed to shake the very foundations of Mount Carmel, as thousands of voices proclaimed the truth that had just been demonstrated with unmistakable clarity. This was no longer a matter of theological debate or competing religious claims, but of witnessed reality that transformed understanding and demanded response. In that moment of divine vindication, the spiritual landscape of Israel was transformed as completely as the physical altar had been consumed. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had proven his reality and power before the assembled nation, answering centuries of faithful prayer and fulfilling promises made to generations of believers who had sometimes wondered if their trust was misplaced. The prophets of Baal, their own failure now highlighted by the dramatic success of Elijah's appeal, found themselves facing not just professional embarrassment, but divine judgment. Their deception, whether intentional or self-deceived, had been exposed before the entire nation, and the people's response left no doubt about which way the wind of spiritual change was blowing. As evening shadows began to lengthen across Mount Carmel, the scene was transformed from a place of desperate appeals and failed hopes into a sanctuary where heaven had touched earth in unmistakable demonstration of divine reality. The long drought was about to end. The spiritual drought that had preceded it was already broken. and a nation was beginning to remember what it meant to worship the one true God who alone deserved their trust, their obedience, and their love. The promise of rain. As the echoes of the people's confession still rang across Mount Carmel, Elijah's attention turned from the consumed altar to the king who had summoned this great gathering. Ahab stood among his courtiers, his face bearing the complex expression of a man whose worldview had just been fundamentally challenged and found wanting. The monarch who had blamed the prophet for 3 years of drought now faced the undeniable reality that the God Elijah served possessed power beyond anything the royal prophets could demonstrate. "Go up, eat and drink," Elijah told the king, his words carrying the authority of one who had just seen heaven vindicate his message before thousands of witnesses. "For there is the sound of abundance of rain." It was a remarkable statement, for the sky above Mount Carmel remained as clear and cloudless as it had been for 3 long years. No wind stirred the air, no hint of moisture touched the atmosphere, no visible sign suggested that the drought was about to break. Yet Elijah spoke with the same confidence he had shown before, calling down fire from heaven, the certainty of one who heard divine promises before they became visible realities. While Ahab and his entourage made their way to seek refreshment, perhaps still trying to process what they had witnessed and its implications for their kingdom, Elijah began to climb higher up Mount Carmel's slopes. His destination was the mountain summit, that place where earth seemed to reach closest to heaven, where men had always gone to seek divine encounter and hear the voice of the Almighty. As he climbed, the prophet's heart was filled with a mixture of gratitude and anticipation that reflected the day's extraordinary events. The fire had fallen exactly as he had known it would, vindicating not just his own ministry, but the reality of the God he served. Now came the second part of the divine promise, the rain that would restore life to the parched land and demonstrate that the same God who controlled fire also commanded the clouds and storms. Reaching the summit, Elijah assumed the posture of intense prayer that had become so familiar to him during his years of walking closely with the Almighty. He cast himself down upon the earth, his face between his knees, his entire being focused on communion with the God who had just demonstrated his power so dramatically before the assembled nation. This was prayer not of uncertainty or desperate pleading, but of faithful expectation, the conversation of a servant with his master about promises already given and soon to be fulfilled. "Go up now," Elijah instructed his servant after some time in prayer. "Look toward the sea." The young man who had accompanied the prophet climbed to a vantage point from which he could survey the western horizon, where the great sea stretched to meet the sky in an unbroken line of blue. For 3 years, that horizon had remained mockingly clear, promising nothing but continued drought and disappointment to those who searched it for signs of approaching relief. "There is nothing," the servant reported, returning to where Elijah continued his intense prayer. The horizon remained as clear as ever, showing no trace of the clouds that would herald the end of their long trial. "Go again," Elijah responded without lifting his head from his position of prayer, his voice carrying no disappointment but only patient persistence. 7 times. It was a pattern that spoke of faith refined through testing, of confidence that rested not on visible evidence, but on divine promises that transcended natural observation. 7 times the servant made the climb. 7 times he searched the horizon with eyes trained by years of hoping for rain, and 6 times he returned with the same report. There is nothing. But faith that has been tested by fire does not waver at the absence of immediate visible confirmation. Elijah continued his prayer with the persistence of one who understood that divine timing often differs from human expectation, that God's purposes unfold according to heavenly rather than earthly schedules. Each negative report only strengthened his resolve to continue interceding until the promise became visible reality. On the 7th journey to the lookout point, the servant's eyes detected something that made his heart quicken with sudden hope. There, on the far western horizon, where sea met sky, a small cloud had appeared, no larger than a man's hand, barely visible against the vast expanse of blue, yet unmistakably real and growing even as he watched. There is a cloud as small as a man's hand rising out of the sea. He called out, his voice carrying excitement and wonder, as he realized he was witnessing the beginning of the answer to 3 years of desperate prayers. The response from Elijah was immediate and decisive. Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. It was another remarkable statement of faith, for the tiny cloud on the distant horizon hardly seemed sufficient to produce the kind of storm that would impede royal travel. Yet Elijah spoke with the authority of one who understood that when God begins to fulfill his promises, the process moves with divine power and speed that often surprise human observers. Even as the servant hurried down the mountain to deliver the prophet's message to King Ahab, the small cloud began to grow with supernatural rapidity. What had been no larger than a man's hand expanded across the western sky like spilled ink spreading across parchment, darkening from white to gray to the deep, pregnant black that promised abundant rainfall. The wind began to stir, first as gentle breezes that carried the scent of approaching moisture, then as stronger gusts that spoke of the storm system building over the great sea. The air itself seemed to change texture, becoming heavy with humidity that had been absent for 3 long years, promising the relief that the land had craved through seasons of desperate need. As Ahab's chariot prepared for hasty departure toward his palace in Jezreel, the first drops of rain began to fall on Mount Carmel's slopes. They came slowly at first, individual droplets that struck the drought-hardened earth with sounds like whispered promises. Then the pace increased, becoming a steady patter that grew into the drumming of abundant precipitation falling from clouds that now covered the entire sky. But perhaps the most remarkable sight of that extraordinary day was yet to come. As King Ahab's chariot rolled down from Mount Carmel toward the valley where his palace waited, Elijah appeared beside the royal vehicle, not riding, but running with supernatural strength and endurance that allowed him to keep pace with the horses throughout their entire journey. The hand of the Lord was upon his prophet, empowering him for this final demonstration of divine favor that would bring the day's revelations to a fitting close. The same God who had sent fire from heaven and rain from the clouds now provided strength for his servant's feet, enabling him to run before the king's chariot as a living symbol of the divine power that had been so dramatically revealed. As they raced through the countryside toward Jezreel, the rain increased in intensity, transforming from drops to streams to torrents that soaked the parched earth and began began the process of restoration that would return prosperity to the land. Fields that had lain barren began to drink deeply of the life-giving moisture. Wells that had run dry started to fill again, and the very air seemed to sparkle with the promise of renewed fertility and abundance. The drought was over, broken not by natural weather patterns or human ingenuity, but by direct divine intervention in response to faithful prayer and complete trust in God's promises. The same deity who had provided flour and oil in a widow's house had now provided rain for an entire nation, demonstrating that his power and care extended from the most intimate household needs to the broadest national requirements. As night fell over a land receiving its first substantial rainfall in 3 years, the events of Mount Carmel took their place among the great testimonies of divine faithfulness that would be remembered and recounted for generations to come. Fire had fallen from heaven, rain had returned to the earth, and a nation had been reminded of the reality and power of the God who had chosen them as his own special people. Yet even as this chapter of miraculous intervention drew to its close, greater purposes were already beginning to unfold, purposes that would carry the demonstration of divine power far beyond the borders of Israel, touching hearts and changing lives in ways that the participants could not yet imagine. The God who specialized in the impossible was far from finished with his plans for those who dared to trust in his unfailing faithfulness and limitless power. A new prophet's calling years had passed since fire fell from heaven on Mount Carmel, and rain returned to the drought-stricken land of Israel. The great prophet Elijah, whose name had become synonymous with divine power and unwavering faith, continued his ministry throughout the northern kingdom. But now he walked with the knowledge that his time of earthly service was drawing toward its appointed end. God had shown him that another would take up the mantle of prophetic authority, continuing the work of calling Israel back to faithful worship of the one true God. The transition came not with dramatic fanfare, but through the quiet, providential encounters that marked so much of divine activity in human affairs. Elijah found his successor in Elisha, a young man whose heart burned with desire to serve the Lord, and whose spirit resonated with the same passion for God's glory that had driven the older prophet through decades of faithful ministry. The torch of prophetic authority was passed with ceremony that was both solemn and joyful, marking the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's spiritual history. Elisha proved to be a worthy successor, demonstrating divine power in ways that both echoed his predecessor's ministry and revealed his own unique calling. He performed miracles of provision and healing, challenged false worship and corrupt leadership, and maintained the prophetic witness that kept alive the flame of true faith in a nation that seemed perpetually tempted to compromise with the attractive but empty promises of foreign gods. It was during these early years of Elisha's ministry that he encountered a situation that would have been heartbreakingly familiar to anyone who remembered the widow of Zarephath and her miraculous provision. This time, however, the setting was Israel itself, and the woman in need was not a foreign widow, but one of their own people, connected by marriage to the community of prophets who served the Lord with such dedication. The widow came to Elisha in the kind of desperation that strips away all pretense and reveals the raw need of the human heart. Her husband had been one of the sons of the prophets, those young men who gathered around the great servants of God to learn from their wisdom and participate in their ministry. He had been a good man, faithful in his service and devoted to his family, but his death had left his wife in circumstances that were both tragic and all too common in their ancient world. "Your servant, my husband, is dead," she told Elisha, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to overflow. "And you know that your servant feared the Lord. And the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves." The situation was desperate beyond mere poverty. In their culture, unpaid debts could indeed result in family members being taken into slavery to work off what was owed. This widow faced not only the loss of her means of support, but the breaking up of her family, the taking of her beloved sons into bondage that might separate them from her forever. It was a crisis that threatened to destroy everything she held dear in this world. Elisha listened to her plea with the same compassion that had marked his predecessor's ministry, understanding that divine power was meant to serve not only great national purposes, but also the most intimate human needs. The God who could send fire from heaven and rain from the clouds was equally concerned with the welfare of widows and orphans, with the preservation of families threatened by circumstances beyond their control. "What shall I do for you?" Elisha asked gently, his question carrying both genuine desire to help and the practical wisdom that recognized the need to work with whatever resources might be available. "Tell me, what do you have in the house?" It was a question that echoed across the years to another widow in another desperate situation, a woman in Zarephath who had once counted her last handful of flour and her final drops of oil. Like her predecessor in faith, this widow's answer spoke of resources so meager as to seem almost absurd in the face of overwhelming need. "Your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil," she replied, her words carrying the weight of careful inventory and painful acknowledgement of how little remained to her. It was a small container, probably containing barely enough oil for a few days' cooking, certainly nothing that could be sold for sufficient money to pay debts large enough to threaten her son's freedom. Yet Elisha heard in her answer not the confirmation of hopelessness, but the foundation for miracle. The same God who had multiplied flour and oil in a foreign widow's home could surely work similar wonders for one of his own people, demonstrating once again that divine provision was not limited by natural scarcity or human impossibility. "Go, borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors. Empty vessels," Elisha instructed, his words carrying the authority of one who spoke not from human wisdom, but divine inspiration. "Do not gather just a few." The instruction seemed peculiar, almost nonsensical. What good would empty containers do for a woman whose primary problem was that she lacked sufficient substance to fill even the small jar she already possessed? Yet there was something in the prophet's tone that inspired confidence, despite the apparent illogic of his directions. The same quality that had marked Elijah's promise to the widow of Zarephath years before. The widow, like her predecessor in miraculous provision, chose faith over skepticism, action over hesitation. She went throughout her neighborhood, approaching friends and acquaintances with the unusual request for empty vessels. Some who heard her plea may have wondered at the strangeness of her need, but most responded with a generosity that marked communities where people understood their mutual dependence and responsibility for one another's welfare. Container after container was brought to her modest dwelling. jars and pots, bowls and vessels of every size and description that her neighbors could spare. They filled her small home until there was barely room to move among them, an impressive collection of empty pottery that represented the faith of a desperate woman and the kindness of a caring community. When the gathering was complete, Elisha provided the final instructions that would transform this collection of empty containers into instruments of divine provision. "Go in and shut the door behind you and your sons," he told her. "Pour it out into all those vessels and set aside the full ones.